You are listening to the I Choose My Best Life podcast with Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, a show that is dedicated to helping you live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally. For additional resources, visit ichoosemybestlife.com.
Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Saundra, and you're listening to I Choose My Best Life. Today, I'm excited to dive into a body of work around marriages and how we can actually help our marriages get to a deeper place of intimacy, a deeper place of fulfillment and delight. And I have joining me today Dr. Dan Allender. He is the author of a newly released book titled The Deep-Rooted Marriage. And I want us to think about that. How deep are the roots of that covenant relationship that you are in? Dr. Dan, I'm excited to go deeper into this because I think sometimes, I know for myself, now I've been married now for 24 years. We get to celebrate our 25th this December. And if I'm completely honest, the roots weren't really deep when we first said yes. There was a whole lot of desire for it to be deep, but it didn't initially start off that way. So I would just love to hear from you, just to start, some of your background in why marriage, why relationship, and really helping people with that part of their life.
Thank you, Saundra. It's just grand to be with you. And let me just say, I don't think any marriage begins with deep roots. It's a seed planted in the ground. And the question is, do we tend to it? Do we work it? And the roots have a potential to develop, but not quickly. But I'm a psychologist. My primary work is with sexual abuse. And one of the places that deeply affects the life of the person who's been harmed is in the context of the most important relationship that happens to be marriage. So from working with trauma, it's been inevitable that I've had the privilege of working with many marriages over about 40 years of work. And as we step into this, I'll just say the only other reality that gives me reason to write about this is I've been married for 48 years. And it has been by far, unquestionably, the best taste of what I believe heaven will be for me in a relationship. But it's also been the taste of what I believe I'll never have to endure, and that's the taste of hell. And that is every marriage, I believe, is a relationship of extremity that's meant to create revelation. You are meant to understand something of your own brokenness and something of your own beauty in a way that no other relationship will give you opportunity for, quite like a marriage. So in that sense, I don't think there's a relationship on this earth that's more potentially transformative than marriage.
I love how you describe even the institution, so to speak, of marriage, especially when I think about just in that description, how in the Bible, this is what the covenant relationship is really built around. We're the bride of Christ. There's this kind of, there's this overtone of marriage and that relationship. And the subtitle of your book, Cultivating Intimacy, Healing, and Delight. And I find that, especially working with the people that you work with who've gone through any type of sexual trauma, it's difficult to have intimacy without healing.
Yeah.
And I think anyone, whether you've gone through sexual trauma or not, there's a large amount of our identity and how we show up in the world that has to be healed to embrace intimacy. What would you say is that you're finding just in the people you work with and what you've researched is one of the biggest hindrances for most of us for intimacy?
Thank you for reading the subtitle, because frankly, most people don't even, shall we say, address the subtitles. So let me answer that by going to one of your subtitles and being fully known. So what is intimacy outside of beholding? If we have the capacity to truly see one another, so right there, I think is one of the huge issues. We don't behold one another. We don't know one another. We may know things about one another, but we don't hold that with the kind of your heartache and your joy is meant to be mine. But notice you talk about beholding and then becoming, which is another word for the word hope. So when we behold, we're centered with one another, but becoming together, not just individually, but becoming who we're meant to be as a couple, it is, I think, one of the hardest things in the world because we're all busy. We all have separate tasks, separate jobs, often separate responsibilities, and becoming together something that we weren't at the beginning that we're becoming now. I don't think most couples live for hope, live with the sense of we can become something that we were not. So I think every marriage begins with some degree of loss or harm because we marry someone really, even if we don't know it, for redemption. So that's the becoming. So if we behold, if we have that becoming, then I love this, that you end that subtitle of your book with the word belonging. It's just perfect because that's the height of what intimacy brings. So if you start with those, we don't behold well. We just survive as independent islands, occasionally overlapping instead of becoming something together. And as a result, I think a lot of couples over time, even in good marriages, end up just having a fundamental loneliness that never has a chance to be expressed, exposed, engaged for a real healing. When you've got, in Genesis chapter 2, God saying, it is not good for man to be alone. This is the God of the universe who made us for him, made us for himself. He's the one saying, you'll be lonely if you do not have someone like you. So in that sense, I think a marriage is meant to have that kind of belonging that dispenses the kind of loneliness that most of us have learned to live with as inevitable and in many ways not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I think that's the sad part. When I think about a lot of the people that I speak with who share that they don't feel like anyone really knows them. I would think that I would only be hearing that from people that aren't married or don't have that type of intimate relationship with someone. But oftentimes I'm hearing it from people who have been married for very long times.
Yes.
And they say, I feel so alone. How can we begin to take those first steps? I agree with you. For a lot of people, they're too busy. They're not stopping long enough to even behold the person that's literally right in front of them every single day. What are some steps someone can take if they're listening right now and they're like, you know what? My spouse is a stranger that I live with. Where do we begin?
Honor your misery. And in so many ways, most of us will not move toward healing unless we own our ailment. And it's too easy to use forms of distraction to escape the reality that at a personal level, at an existential level, I am lonely. I want more. Where are you moving to find more? More of your work, more play, more Netflix. As you begin to own, and it seems vastly too simple. Admit what's true. The truth will set you free. I think many others have said well before me, but it will at least initially make you miserable. So can you own the fact you're in a marriage and it's empty? You're lonely. And in many ways, you've simply learned to endure it. So instead of, in one sense, being enraged, can you grieve? Can you allow your heart to own and begin to say, how have I, not my spouse, how have I allowed my own heart to become a desert? How have I allowed my heart to have so little life? But the life I do find, frankly, not wrong, but so less than what I was meant for. That level of honesty, self-awareness, I don't find easily found especially in the context of the Christian community. I think we're very good at pretending or feeling responsible to be more positive, more forgiving than what it seems to be in order to be able to say, I really am miserable. But in owning that, the natural thing, what happened to Adam and Eve is the moment they're exposed, they hide and then they blame. So I think the second issue is when you begin to own your own misery, your own sense of this is not well, then can you open the door to the question of what about your own past? What about your own trauma? What about your own heartache has set you onto a path where you have been pretending and denying or demanding, and therefore your spouse has even further moved away from you? It's a simple premise. Can we deal with the log in our own eye? That's not taking false blame, but it's at least beginning with our own story and our own life. Those two things. Am I aware, and will I create ownership with regard to my life? That is a beginning that may, frankly, make your marriage worse. But at least you're engaged in a way that in the past, it was too easy just to quote unquote get along.
That makes me think about how sometimes when I hear a couple say, oh, we never fight, we never argue, I sometimes want to ask, are you talking at all? Because it can be sometimes easier to just to not have the conversation and just put it under the rug and act like nothing's going on than to allow those conflicts to be a part of the healing process. What are your thoughts as it relates to conflict within marriage? Is this something we should be avoiding or something we should be leaning into and allowing it to become part of our healing process?
Oh, I totally agree with you. Without conflict, there is no intimacy. The two of you are different. Fundamentally, at the core of your being, you are different. You might have a lot of things you're in common along, but the differences are profound. Now get into them. But here's the core issue. When you get into conflict, your body usually experiences at some level of small t trauma and sometimes capital T trauma. So what we know with regard to trauma of any form is that it creates a kind of fragmentation where your left hemisphere, your left frontal lobe seems to go a bit offline. And then it's easy to remain internally numb. So how do you handle conflict? What's your history of conflict? Are you one who is much more flee, much more fight, much more freeze or fawn? Those are the four major categories for addressing trauma. You need to know your own way of handling being triggered, because in any conflict, even small matters, you're going to feel triggered. And then the question is, what's your history of how you've responded to your body's experience of stress biochemicals like adrenaline, noradrenaline, catecholamines? Again, as you begin to put all the language, I need to know that I'm a fighter. So when there's a conflict between my wife and I shout. She has a long history of fleeing. It worked brilliantly for the first, decade of our marriage. I would shout, she would comply, until, thank God, she became so much kinder and wiser, not only to her own heart, but to mine. So she began disrupting me. Let me just say, it did not go well. It doesn't still go well, but when we're in it, we've got language now of knowing how a fight versus flight response to trauma tends to create stonewalling on her part or a kind of belligerence on mine. And now if we can own that's not who I want to be, it's not who I'm made to be, I need to be willing to address all the realities of how trauma has played out in my own life to begin the healing process, not just for me, but for my wife and hers, for herself, but as well for me. So conflict actually introduces you to who you are at your best and at your worst. So when I say that a marriage is revelatory, it's only conflict that makes that clear.
That there's so much freedom in that statement because I feel like sometimes it's almost as if we're taught that we should be avoiding conflict in marriage, which then just perpetuates the problem and we never get to a place of healing. I know for myself, my husband and I, we had this, I can't remember what prompted it, but we were like, hey, let's take a look at some of these questions to you answer separately and I answer separately. And then we're going to read each other answers. And then we're going to not talk about it for an hour or two to process what the answers were. And then it's a cool off if you need to or whatever. And then come together and we're going to discuss this. And I remember it was one of those times where in the moment, it's like after reading the answers, you feel the initial kind of twinges of the trauma. It's, oh, that cut like a dagger. I didn't like that at all. But there was so much healing and such a deeper level of intimacy and delight that came from that because we stopped hiding from it. We stopped acting like it wasn't there. We actually started to have a conversation around it, even though the conversation wasn't like one of those happy conversations. It still was a needed conversation. And so with your background in like trauma therapy, practical things people can do, couples can do to start this process towards deeper rooted marriage, what are some of the practical things you would recommend for a couple to begin with?
Start with one of the core premises of what's called the Gottman research orientation toward marriage. And it's that contempt is the number one killer of marriage.
Wow.
So you've got to make some honest, but also exposing engagements with regard to how do you use contempt. Now, contempt can be directed against yourself. That's how Becky, my wife, would have been more oriented, or other-centered contempt, which was what I was much better at. But when you begin to go, no contempt is of God. No contempt is honoring. In fact, the name Satan means the accuser. And the structure of accusation is ultimately a form of contempt. So owning up to contempt is there in every marriage. So owning it, and then being able to say, let's talk about how you bring contempt into this conversation. Let's talk about how you bring it in, and then talk about what happens in the cycle, that dance of contempt. It is an ugly dance, and yet it's part of almost every marriage process. So once we come to name it, own it, and then begin to say that we intend to be a contempt-free marriage. Now, will anyone ever accomplish it? No, because you're a sinner and you struggle with lust and anger, adultery and murder. So you will never be 100% free until you are literally face to face with Jesus. But that doesn't mean you can't disrupt it. So one of the principles we operate on is the moment one of us feels contempt in ourselves or in the other, all things stop. You don't go. You don't have another minute. You don't have another conversation. It's a game changer. It's time out. Now, what Becky's found is that my contempt, when it comes, needs time for me to process. So she'll look at me at times and simply say, I think you need a walk. I think you need to take a walk. But what we also know from trauma studies is that walking lowers cortisol. Walking lowers our stress biochemicals. So a 5-minute walk down the driveway, down to our mailbox and back, 5 minutes. And that's sometimes all I need. There are other times it's a couple miles. And that's where she'll say something like, why don't you take a walk with Jesus? I think he has a lot to talk to you about. And even that invitation usually just pisses me off. But it's also true. And we've committed ourselves. And even though we fail, it's yes. Okay, now that you've got the disruption of the triggering process, we use contempt to shield us from shame. That requires us to be able to name, what's the core shame I feel in this argument about whether or not we're going to spend a week or two in North Carolina with friends of ours over summer vacation. Part of that issue wasn't the time, it was the money. So once you start messing with what conflicts are over, they often get down to core issues of where you're afraid or where you're angry. And can we begin to allow that to get named? And sometimes we have found that writing, like we just can't even be in a conversation because it's too heated. So I write her a letter. She reads it literally at the time and writes back. So we have found ways to, shall we say, lower the intensity and slow down. Those are the two biggest things I think people fail at with regard to conflict.
That's so good. And it's enlightening because when I think back to that process my husband and I walked through, we didn't have the vocabulary. I would have loved if we had the vocabulary to name it for what it was. But that is what we were sharing, those places where this was popping up in our relationship. And we actually did come up with kind of, I call it a safe word, a word where we can, when you recognize it, you can say that so the other person at least pauses long enough to turn the mirror back on themselves for a moment.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And it helps so much because you don't know. It's one of those things where I think sometimes you're so used to your own traumatic experience and the trauma that you put on other people that you don't recognize it when you're doing it. And the way that they're perceiving it, you don't know how someone's perceiving what you're saying or how they're taking it. And so it's so helpful just to even begin to identify, oh, it's not what I said, it's the tone of voice that actually is triggering or the look.
And again, this is where I would say, looking at some of the work that you have done, the notion that sleep does not equal rest. It's a part of rest, but it's not enough. So when you begin to go getting along, I'm all for getting along, but there are conflicts because of differences. Now, can we enter them in a way in which we're not increasing our sense of trauma with one another? I think a lot of couples come to this notion of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, where they basically go, every time we talk about sex, every time we talk about money, it gets ugly. And what we've decided is, because we love each other, we don't want to feel that. I don't want you to feel it. I don't want to feel it. So it's best to avoid it. Come on. Any soil that you choose to avoid, you have an enemy. You really do. You have an enemy. And that enemy will plant seeds of dissension, division, disappointment. And that's why people will say, how did the divorce occur? It was over how they put the cap on a toothpaste. And you go, no, it can't be that. And the answer is, no, it wasn't. But it became that tipping point where there has been 10, 20 years of just, we didn't have the courage and honesty. We didn't have the capacity to own our own log, to enter into these conversations where there's really, as you put it so well, the potential for healing. That's, to me, what I understand your work with regard to rest is. Like, you can do certain things called good sleep, but it will not provide you with rest until you deal with these other 7 factors. And in terms of our book, it's back to, can we step into the hard, dirty soil? Because those roots need nutrients, and they will not grow in the way you were meant to if you won't do the kind of work we're putting words to.
So beautiful. I want to conclude with this. Our time is moving quicker than I would care for. I would love to know, and when we're thinking about getting these roots deeper, as I mentioned, and as you stated, we start off marriages really in the shallow areas sometimes. We found the person, we love them, we are attracted to them, all the things that get us to the point of yes. And now we're having to work through all of our differences, our hurts, our pains, our past, our future, all the things. How can we nurture these roots? What are some ways that couples can continue, just a final kind of closing thought before we get to some of the details of how to connecting with you, as how someone can really connect deeper.
I am the face of God to my wife, Becky, and she for me. And when you take responsibility, literal responsibility, no one's face is more close to what God is meant to be. I fail at that profoundly, and yet there is no one who has loved my wife as much and as well as I have. If we can bear both beauty, the beauty of what love brings, and the brokenness, and understand in many ways as simple a reality as there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, and nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, the beginning and the end of Romans chapter 8, then we've got this foundation to begin to say, my marriage is meant not to be convenient nor comfortable, certainly not something that I have control over, but is meant to transform me. Now, I didn't say that when I made vows. I probably didn't even have the thought for the first 10 or 15 years of marriage. But when it does come to be real for you, I want my marriage to help me become more like Jesus. I can guarantee you, your marriage will change. Maybe not for the easier or better quickly, but it will change because you'll be engaging the struggles in your marriage with a very different, shall we say, foundation for dealing with past trauma and current struggles.
Wow, this has been so enlightening. And I just love the way you describe marriage. I've never heard anyone really even speak about it in that way. But there's such a depth of understanding of the Father's heart that you put into even how you describe it that I feel will help a lot of people see the potential that's there. I think we have gotten into kind of a comfort zone of what marriage looks like and have not gone to the level of revelation that's really possible.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so honoring.
We've been chatting with Dr. Dan Allender. He is the co-author with Steve Call of the book, The Deep-Rooted Marriage, Cultivating Intimacy, Healing, and Delight. And I want to make sure that people know how to get in contact with you to learn more to get a copy of their book, as well as to learn more about some of the resources that are available.
I can be found at theallendercenter.org. And again, if somebody wants to get the book, I always want you to first go to a local bookstore. But if Amazon is your next course, Jeff Bezos will personally deliver my book to you.
Excellent. I love it. And we will link to the website that was mentioned, the Allender. Let me make sure I have it. The Allender Center. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Excellent. We will link to the website as well as to the book so that you can quickly get a copy and dive deeper into this. Marriage and strengthening our relationships is not just for Valentine's Day and February and all of the cliche parts of that. I think we need to break out of those molds a little bit and realize that it's something that can be improved at any time. Get a copy. Sit down with your spouse. Walk through some of this process together to get to that place of revelation of what's possible. Dr. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Saundra, so delightful. Thank you.
Until next time, everyone, live fully, loved boldly, and rest intentionally. If you're a woman going through times of transitions, seasons changing in your life, and questioning what God has for you now, I invite you to join me for the Being Fully Known book club starting June 2nd. Grab your copy, and with it, you'll receive free access to an exclusive book club-only study guide, as well as companion videos that go along with each section. Join us at beingfullyknown.com.